InFi, episode 29.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance, hosted by American economist and author Dr. Robert Murphy. Each week, tune in for dynamic discussions with business pioneers about emerging trends in finance, life insurance, asset management, technology, and more. Now, let's talk the future of finance.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today I'm speaking with Joshua Maddox, who is head of developer ecosystem at Provenance Blockchain Foundation. We talk about, of course, what Provenance does specifically, but more generally, we hit some of the themes we've been doing in this podcast series, talking about like what's the difference between a public blockchain and a private one, or the in-between one with a validator set, that sort of thing. Why would you want to have real-world assets put onto a blockchain? Doesn't that defeat the purpose? We cover all those sorts of issues. And we also talk about something that's important to both Joshua and myself, namely, how do we use these new technologies, not just to make the people who see the future and build these new tools wealthy in the process, but also to spread benefits around the world, and in particular to people right now that are located in countries where they don't have access to traditional banking services the way many of us take for granted. So interesting conversation. Joshua definitely is one of the good guys building tools to help everybody. And so I look forward to sharing our discussion with you. Josh, welcome to the InFi podcast.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Well, yeah, so a lot to talk about. Maybe before we get into your current role, can you maybe speak a bit about your background? Like, were you into Bitcoin, for example, when it first came out, or were you someone who could kick the tires first?
Yeah, so I think our first experience with Bitcoin was back in 2014. We had a company called Cinderhouse Creative, it's now just called Cinderhouse, that did work with SMEs and Fortune 500s, et cetera, in China, US, Australia, et cetera. And we had a client who asked us if they could pay us in Bitcoin because they thought it would be fun. We agreed, and sadly, instantly sold it. And I think it was about, if I remember right, it was about $75 or something at the time. And we still have that transaction hash just to beat ourselves over the head.
Yeah, I have a similar background too, where I'm an economist with did a lot of libertarian writing and speaking and so forth. So that community was really into Bitcoin early on. And like you say, I had a bunch of people just wanting to buy things, and it was like a new fad. And hey, do you accept Bitcoin? And my thought process was, well, sure, because if it's a sale that I might not otherwise do, I'll accept it, and then I can just get rid of it. And it's probably not going to drop in value while I'm holding it. And yeah, so not too much went through my hands, but I do know some people, like musicians and things, that were in that space where they didn't even want to think about how many Bitcoins went through their possession, when they were struggling artists. So
yeah, it was an interesting time for sure.
Okay, so have you been in the financial sector your whole career?
Yeah, maybe I'll just give a quick rundown. So, I spent roughly 15 years in China doing startups and foundations. We had a startup in Beijing about 2 years before the Beijing Olympics, and we were really focused on helping multinational organizations who were just landing in China pair with their domestic counterparts. Worked a lot around just communications, set up how to actually find communications, cultural norms, etc. And we ended up having a successful exit of that organization after the Olympics. I think it was 2009, maybe early 2010. And ended up going to work for the British Schools Foundation. And what was supposed to be a bit of a working sabbatical ended up turning into a 7-year stint. And I'll get into that later. But during that time, we founded a company called Cinderhouse that I mentioned earlier, and it was focused on social entrepreneurship. And what we would do is we had a team of people who would all vote on different products, whether it was a product launch or a marketing campaign, et cetera, that we wanted to work on. We would vote, and then any profit above sustainability over salaries, et cetera, we would put into social enterprise case studies. And through that work, we kind of got well versed into blockchain and a few other technologies. And we worked for some large organizations and small organizations like IBM, Lenovo, and Long and Willis Tells, Westpac in Australia, etc. And it was during that period I got introduced to Jacqueline Novogratz. We were invited to the Skoll World Forum, which is a large symposium for social entrepreneurship for some of the work that we were doing at Cinderhouse. And met Jacqueline at that conference. She seemed to be one of the most real individuals I had met who was trying to tackle issues of poverty and injustice around the globe through business means. And her brother is probably more well-known by this audience, the Novogratz of Galaxy. But anyways, I ended up leading marketing and engineering for them during that period for a project called Acumen Academy. And we grew that to be about 500,000 members and 600,000 signups in about 193 countries. And we did launches with, Facebook, IKEA Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, et cetera. And
so what did that? It was an academy. What did that do?
Yeah, so what they would do is they had a network of investees and fellows around the globe. And one of the biggest needs were, how do we actually solve some of these business challenges that arise on a daily basis and get networked to the people who can help us to access further capital, access, contacts inside of industries that you may need to access. And so it was a bit like Masterclass. If you're familiar with Masterclass, is how it started, where there were some notable business people who volunteered time to come teach classes to social entrepreneurs around the world. And then that ended up growing and scaled to also be like a VC funnel. So that way they have like Acumen Angels, for example, where you could go through, get the education that you needed for social entrepreneurship, and then end in angel funding if you had the right idea at the right moment. So.
Okay. By the way, I should probably mention for the people watching the video that even though as we're recording this, it's very close to St. Patrick's Day, our outfits are not coordinated. This was just spontaneous. Hopefully it'll be a lucky discussion. So yeah, a lot there I want to follow up on. But before we get too far afield from it, I did want to circle back. So you had mentioned that you were working with sort of coordinating multinational people with their counterparts in China. Is there anything you can tell us about that? Like I've talked to various U.S.-based either business people or economists like from academia who have gone to China. And I get two different stories depending on who I talk to. One person says, yeah, they're still communist. I mean, they're run by, it's run by the Communist Party. The other people are like, no, that's all just, that's the name. Doesn't really, they're there to do business. They do whatever policies they think are going to promote growth and so forth. Can you just, anything you're comfortable sharing in terms of your experience and maybe where you think they are now?
Sure. So, I really enjoyed my time in China and love the country, love the people. And there's problems in China like anywhere else, and some of them more severe than others and some less. I think where people have that mixed view is it depends on the scale of the organization in terms of how the government's going to interact with you and what your business is actually doing. So the example I would give to some people is in some cases you have more freedom there in China than you do in the US if you're a very small, tiny business. Like, I would say, try to launch a business in the US for $50,000 that, can actually scale up and serve a local neighborhood or, some local population. And it's very difficult because of rightful regulations that we have in the US and some not rightful regulations that we have in the US. However, the inverse starts to happen as you begin to scale up in China. And the more scrutiny you have, the more overwatch you have, the more you have to have Chinese partners and you have to have government partners, et cetera. I would also say the pace at which things moved in China as a small organization is very, very fast. Like things happen very quickly. You can get things done and move. You don't have much bureaucracy. That can be a net positive and a net negative for, certain societal impacts. But as you begin to scale, you do hit the red tape and it becomes a lot more about guanxi or relationship and who you know and who you don't know. All in all, I don't think that there was significant business in what our difference in what we were doing, but we were small in scale and that would be why.
Okay, interesting. Okay, well, maybe we should transition, and I do want to circle back to the social responsibility and that element in a bit, but just maybe just speak a bit about your current role at Provenance. We've had, I think, at least two people from Provenance, Anthony Morrow being the first person we did on this podcast series. But can you just explain for those who, maybe they haven't heard those episodes, What does Provenance do, and what's your role there?
Brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, I lead a developer ecosystem, basically helping organizations get founded into Provenance Blockchain, making sure they're connected and have an easy path towards development. So it's a bit of product, it's a bit of BD, and a bit of DevRel all kind of rolled into one. Provenance Blockchain, we were founded back in 2018 by Mike Cagney, the former CEO and co-founder of SoFi. And him and Jun Ao set out to build a blockchain for regulated financial services from US perspective primarily. And if you fast forward to today, what you have is Figure. Provenance Blockchain was spun out as its own foundation. We're a nonprofit that helps to grow the ecosystem. Figure is now the largest HELOC provider in the US, a non-banking HELOC provider, excuse me. They did a little over 1 billion in HELOCs on Provenance in October alone. And Provenance was really kind of built and constructed out of people diving into the regulatory mud and trying to figure out the end-to-end financial digital asset lifecycle from that regulated perspective. And so we're built on the Cosmos SDK Tendermint platform, and we add purpose-built components into the ecosystem that make it easier, cheaper, faster, safer for large-scale enterprises and institutions and fintechs alike to build products and services on blockchain while staying compliant and while adhering to whatever their regulatory jurisdiction may be. In a sentence, Provenance Blockchain is a blockchain for regulated financial services.
Okay, great. I want to unpack all that. I should probably say it's sort of understood, but Infineo and Provenance are collaborating, and so if people want to know, that's partly why we're so interested. But we chose you guys for a reason, and so that's partly why we're having you on the show and so forth to showcase what you're doing. Okay, so a lot to unpack there. So maybe that's one thing we can start with. I think at this point in the conversation, the people are having, it's moved beyond this, but there was a period, not in the not too distant past, where the randomly selected person, maybe even who was in the financial sector, they heard crypto, they heard blockchain, and they thought, oh, that's a completely unregulated Wild West, almost by its design and nature. And so, for you to talk about a blockchain dedicated to regulated financial products, especially in the United States, that almost might have sounded like an oxymoron. So can you just talk a little bit about those two different competing visions?
Yeah, sure. And, I think people are right to have that hesitation. There are a lot of scams and problems in the blockchain industry, and it's fairly prevalent. And I think that's where Provenance Blockchain has really shown out because, if you look at, I talk about Figure a bit because it's useful to understand, how we have the ethos we do and why we have become, a leader in real world assets in that regulatory space, is that if you're trying to build a blockchain that follows the regulations in whatever jurisdiction that you're in, sometimes those regulations haven't been written yet. And it can be very difficult to comply. So Figure had a habit of working very close with US regulators, making sure that as we went through, whether it was HELOCs or private equity that was being issued on chain, that we were taking all of the steps that you need to do to comply with the existing ecosystem. So hard examples would be KYC, AML, the sort of a first stop, qualified custody of assets, ensuring that you have the tools that you need to do reporting and analytics, making sure that you're doing monitoring and evaluation. So, for example, we have one of the leaders in the monitoring and evaluation space that's plugged in, that offers services to anyone in Provenance, that works alongside the SEC. So that way you can get transaction scores to understand how much risk you may have in trading with a counterparty. But fundamentally, what we allow you to do is go as fully private or as fully permissioned as you need to be. So you can have a private zone construct where you fully control your validator set, and we can get into why that's needed, but fully control your validator set until the moment you can push a button and there's regulatory clarity that will allow you to bring assets onto a public chain. For those who do have more of that public mindset, or their business use case allows them to be on a public chain, then they can come in, build fully, public. There's 60 plus validators around the globe that support transactions that are happening on Provenance. And you can dial in your level of risk. So, for example, maybe your asset is in a jurisdiction where you don't have to do bank grade due diligence on trading with a counterparty. Well, you can then set what criteria you need in something we call the attributes module that allows you to dial in exactly what you need for your asset to trade with that counterparty. Maybe you're a more risk averse player and you need a basket of KYC providers to be able to approve and ensure that your asset isn't going to trade with a various third party. Then you can dial in exactly who you need in order for that asset to trade. So the point is to allow people to go very granular with their regulatory needs.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. Again, I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to approach this. So, yeah, let's start simply. Like it'll, folks, don't worry. Like I'll start very basic. For people who really don't know this, but we'll quickly get into
Right.
areas that are more interesting for those who know the basic outline. But I don't want to leave anybody at the curb, as I say. Okay, so the big picture is if you're a company that deals in the financial sector and you have assets that you want there to be some liquidity in, you want there to encourage trading in these assets, using the blockchain, just big picture, has a lot of utility because, there's certain characteristics of it in which it's more decentralized than, like what would be the case 20 years ago, even with, digital finance. And there's very nice things about it, like you don't need to have people sitting at a customer service desk and so on. But the problem is, if it's a purely public chain, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joshua, but by that you mean the sort of thing where the entities that can come on board and participate in the designation or the determination of what's the next block that gets added to the chain, that's open to the world. Like if you wanted to log in and become a Bitcoin miner, no, you don't have to go get approved by somebody. You don't have to show who you are. You can try to do that. Whereas when you're talking about like having a validator set and things like, is that what you're talking? You're restricting what type of people can come in and sort of be like the referees as to which provenance transactions get approved and added to the chain?
That's right. Yeah. Maybe let me give you like three concrete use cases that kind of explain that.
Yeah, you're probably more used to explaining this to newbies than I am, so go ahead.
No worries. So I'll start with fully private. There are some regulatory jurisdictions that presume, and there's no legal precedent for this yet, but there's a lot of assumption in some of the regulatory sandboxes that exist around the globe, whether you're in MICA or Luxembourg or APAC, et cetera, UK. There are some regulatory jurisdictions that view validators as broker-dealers. And meaning if a validator approves a block that has your asset in it, or if you originate your asset and that is touched by a validator, they view that as being a broker-dealer, but it also could have side consequences. Like if you want your asset to be underneath Luxembourg jurisdiction, for example, or maybe you're a Swiss entity and you want it to be based in Switzerland, and you go to originate your asset and inadvertently a US-based validator originates your asset, there's big questions now about which jurisdiction your asset falls under now. Is it under US jurisdiction? Is it under Luxembourg, et cetera? So controlling your validator set can often be something that has to be baked in to comply with local regulations and ensure that you are in the right jurisdiction. Okay, that's one example. There's a bunch of other examples for this one. On public, it may be that you have every intent to do KYC and know your customer under AML guidelines. And you set out as entity.
And that's anti-money laundering, just in case someone...
it's cheesy.
Yeah, probably 95% of listeners probably do that, but just make sure.
Yeah, they do for that. Yeah, so under anti-money laundering framework, you have to know your customer. And if you don't, there can be some very hefty fines. Your business can even be shut down. So you can have every intent to do KYC initially, but once your token is on a public blockchain, on most blockchains, you can't then control who that trades with, right? So you may know your initial customer, but then that customer may trade with a third-party counterparty, and now all of a sudden you're out of compliance. And you did everything you could to stay in compliance. So Provenance has those controls, or we say even the third or fourth party that you trade with, if they don't meet certain know your customer or AML framework guidelines, you can choose whether or not your asset will trade. We don't want to be in the business of deciding for you. That should be a business choice for you personally and in your jurisdiction, but you can make that choice. And then the last piece is some constructs demand certain levels of privacy. And when you are trading on public blockchain, transactions get added to a pool called the mempool, and everyone can see that who is validating. They can see what transactions exist in there, and all of a sudden you end up with what are called MEV attacks, where you can now start front running trades. I can see Bank X is about to buy in dollars of Y asset. And I can then front run them with my validator very quickly and change the price significantly. I can do that in the middle with something people call a sandwich attack, or I can do that in the back. And there's lots of MEV attacks. So there's kind of those are three examples of why you may need privacy, why you may want to bake in, compliance, and why you may need a private construct instead of a main.
Okay, great. And again, the big picture is, you've did a great job there explaining some of the real world messiness involved and how, hey, one thing might seem great, but then, oh wait, there's these issues. And so again, you just leave it up to the client, like the party that approaches you guys and says, we're thinking about building on Provenance, and then you just consult with them and give them tips in terms of what their business model is and the regulations, so that if it's a good fit, they turn all the dials and figure out the best way to use Provenance.
That's right. We have two ways of helping people make those decisions. So one, if you're coming to the foundation, we have a hash grants program. We have blockchain solutions engineer who will come in and, we offer a minimum number of hours within the resources that we have to help you design exactly how you're going to get on Provenance, how you'll take your business use case and apply that onto, a blockchain use case. And then we also have something that's just being stood up called Prov Labs. For full disclosure, I think Infineo is one of the customers of Prov Labs. And what we offer is capital markets expertise. That is a for-profit entity separate from the foundation that then helps people go deeper into exactly how they would design their builds, how they would construct everything that they need to kind of be off to the races on Provenance. And what you end up finding is many of the assets that are starting to come on and be built, many of the proof of concepts that are being built, they're very new, and people end up needing a lot more support sometimes than they may think if it is an asset that already doesn't have an existing roadmap out there. And so that's where Prov Labs steps in.
Okay, great. And maybe if we just do one more quick one on Provenance per se, then we will open it up maybe to just the industry as a whole. I think that probably the best way for people who don't fully get it, or people who might be cynical or skeptical is probably a better term, to say, yeah, I get in principle what you're talking about, but what's the big... To me, I think, people going out and doing it. So the fact you just said, if I got it right, that in October alone, so this is October 2023, if you will listen to this later, that Figure, originated $1 billion in HELOCs just in October?
Yeah, that's just in October alone. So let me walk this number back beneath you. I think the latest number, this is coming from Figure, not from us. I believe they've done over 30 billion in HELOC transactions or transactions over the lifetime. Within 10 of the top 20 mortgage providers are originating assets on Provenance, along with Figure. We've become the largest blockchain for real world assets, with a little over 10 billion in RWA TVL. And like I said, Figure became the largest non-bank lending HELOC provider in the US. And the reason why, the real benefit.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, is just, can you give us the intuition? If I need a HELOC, like banks give a HELOC, what are you talking about? Why would I, what do I got to put it in my MetaMask wallet? I don't get it. Like, so to somebody who just really doesn't even get what you're talking about, can you explain why this is happening?
Yeah. So the real use case is any place that you have a bunch of intermediaries all kind of taking little slices of the pie along the way is potentially a good use for blockchain. If there's intermediaries and you need truth over trust, then that's a place to start exploring. So with HELOCs, again, I'm not the expert on this, but if I remember right, there was 17 intermediaries inside of that HELOC process that they were able to cut down to, I believe, a 2 or 3 step process. And they were able to save about 150 bits of savings in that HELOC origination process, which is quite significant. And so I think, at least with HELOCs, we've now seen 6% of all 2023 HELOCs. And for those not US, HELOC is just a second mortgage product. saw 6% of all US HELOCs done on Provenance. Now, that's the only asset class that we're aware of that has been genuinely disrupted by blockchain. You see 6% of something happening.
Right.
You know, it's not the
Right.
0.01% that we see with like T-bills or something like that. And the reason why is I think people were dragged across the chasm, if you will, instead of crossing the chasm because of those dips of savings. And if they did not jump in, the savings were expansive enough, the speed was expand fast enough that, you know, you stand to be disrupted. And now we're starting to see that happening with a few other asset classes as well. So it's trust over truth. It's cutting out intermediaries that are unnecessary and then having that information on blockchain. So that way you don't have to trust a counterparty in order to know whether the loan application, for example, is still in its correct state. You don't have to trust a counterparty to know what the valuation of a particular asset may be, et cetera.
Okay, great. And so my understanding is with Figure, from the end user's perspective, someone just, you know, they want to apply for a HELOC, and again, like say for foreign, you know, it's a home equity line of credit, that they go online and the Figure, it's not that they say, oh, I'm a tech savvy person and I really like blockchain. They don't even care about that. It's just that they're shopping around and that's the best rate they can get, you know, given their home and so forth. And then to explain why is that, like you're saying, because using the blockchain in this case just cuts out so many intermediaries and that's where the savings come from.
That's exactly right. You know, you have people getting HELOCs today. You know, you have grandmas and, you know, Gen Zs alike getting their HELOCs on Figure without knowing that they're touching blockchain. And I think that's what most of the products, the user experience for most products have to become in order for blockchain to progress into this next phase of evolution is you shouldn't know that you're using blockchain. Nobody cares if the back-end system of their bank is using AWS or Google Drive or Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, you know? So
right.
You shouldn't have to care as an individual which blockchain your product is touching.
Right. And I remember, again, we were talking about the Bitcoin evangelism days, you know, many years ago when people I knew who wanted Bitcoin to take out, and they were like going around to local merchant and trying to argue with them and, you know, hey, if we could all just do that. And I remember saying to some of them, like, no, the way this is going to penetrate is when it becomes easy and people don't even care. It just works better. You know, you just do it on your phone or something. So anyway, I think that's what Figure is showing is, you don't have to convince someone of the merits of blockchain technology. If it works, if it makes sense. In other words, if it didn't have efficiencies built into it, then it wouldn't work anyway. People are just going to do it just because, you know, like they believe in the cause or something. Like it's got to make a sense of fit, you know, in terms of the economics. And then if it does, you don't need to convince people ideologically. They're just going to go ahead and embrace it.
Yeah, we're just getting back to business fundamentals, right? Mm-hmm. Like, for a long chain of blockchain, there was good reasons for this in some cases. I'm not being the ethos of Web3. I get excited about some of it myself, but at some point you do have to have basic business fundamentals, and people are going to be attracted to value. And if you're not delivering value, people aren't going to stick around and cheer on your product just because it's X, Y, Z blockchain.
Right. And that ties into the issue about, like, you know, poverty elimination. I know that's that's on your LinkedIn profile. That's something you care about. And I do want to come back to that because it dovetails what we were just talking about. But before I lose the train of thought, you mentioned a couple times this slogan, truth over trust. Can you just expand on that? What do you mean in this context when you talk about that?
Yeah, and there's a lot of transactions that exist in the financial sector and really in any sector where there are different organizations. Some of them stood up for good reasons. Some of them they're basically rent seeking, but they're in the middle of transactions, and a lot of them are having to prove details. So take example with the loan application. You know, once you have a loan application in, I don't know what the time frame is, but you have to reprove that loan application hasn't mutated, you know, since you originated the loan. And there's several intermediaries in the middle of that. Well, you can have that loan application on blockchain and prove that the state of that loan application has never changed. Well, there's one intermediary that gets cut out, and you're giving truth over having to trust someone's word. And so any place where you are having to trust a third party, that could be a place where you put the magnifying glass and your business hat on, decide whether or not this is something that can be cut out with just peer-to-peer trust mechanism, where you can trust that the data or the transaction hasn't mutated over time, versus having to trust a counterparty in order to get to the next step of whatever transaction you're doing. And I think a really hard example of this is JP Morgan did a POC on Provenance called Project Guardian, and they were able to cut out 4,000 steps. This is coming from them, from their report. They were able to cut out 4,000 internal steps. They were rebalancing a fund across multiple chains, and they were able to cut out 4,000 steps. I think they were able to save about 20% of internal cost. And their estimation was the reduction of those steps and reducing that 20% would create a $400 billion per year market. And that's just, per year. And all of those steps that are getting cut out for the most part, and that 20% savings, it's coming from understanding that you can see truth in something rather than having to trust another counterparty to have done something.
Okay, great. I mean, and that's, big picture, the whole point, or not the whole point, but one of the big points of putting real world assets right on blockchains, whether it's Provenance or other ones, is that they're, the asset that the end user owns, there's like a community that acknowledges that fact, that ownership claim, as opposed to just, I have my money's in a particular bank somewhere. And well, how do you know? Well, because if I log in, their website says it is. And, they're a big firm. And if they just took my money, I could call the police, I suppose, or just, word of mouth, people would stop giving their money to that bank. But I'm ultimately relying on the goodwill of the bank, either their integrity or, their competence, that they're not going to make a bookkeeping error on their end. Whereas something's a blockchain, again, whether it's truly public or even just a limited set of validators. But the idea is that responsibility is more diffused. There's like a whole community of people that if something gets added to the chain, they've all signed off, or at least, in a process that one of them's randomly picked or something, if it's a proof of stake. So that they're, again, the point being diffusing the responsibility, so you're not just relying on the integrity or the competence of one institution.
Yeah, and, I would say that has been the idea, and that has been the hope. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of cases where even in blockchain that hasn't been the case. So, if you look at FTX or Celsius or, Three Arrows Capital, et cetera, we've seen these blow up where people have trusted centralized exchanges. And so in theory, yes, to exactly what, you just said, really, you don't even want to trust those other community members who are validating that this is right. You want to be able to go to the data source itself and cryptographically prove that this thing is real. Mm-hmm. Now, at some point, yes, you do have to start trusting the ecosystem, because not everybody's going to sit in their home checking the cryptographic proofs of a block. But this is where I think you see some really interesting things coming up on Provenance. Like Figure has found a company called DART, that's called Digital Asset Registry Technologies. And if you notice, like when FTX collapse happened and the Celsius collapse happened, everybody had cryptocurrency. And then all of a sudden they were in bankruptcy court trying to figure out who gets the cryptocurrency. And why is that if the promise of blockchain is real, right? Mm-hmm. It became centralized. And then all of a sudden in bankruptcy court, it was not clear who had first rights, to the assets that FTX had, et cetera, Celsius had. And so what what DART does is it does a UCC filing that perfects ownership of the asset. So on Provenance, if you come and first heal up here, you're getting a token. If you register through DART, you now have a physical UCC filing that perfects the actual ownership of the asset. And then there's two things that happen. One is you have truth over trust on the blockchain itself. You have the cryptographic proof of the state of whatever it was that you had. So there's the first proof set. And then you have the regulatory environment where you actually have the UCC filing that gives you, true ownership over that asset. So that's something that people, I think, are going to be forced to start looking at more and more, and not just blockchain, because it's great if your asset is on blockchain, but then you go to bankruptcy court and you'd say, here's the cryptographic proof. And they're like, yes, but, this lender, this creditor gets first access, right? So,
Right. And that too, I mean, you're talking about FTX, and I remember back, I guess Mt. Gox was one of the earlier ones in terms of just Bitcoin, and I remember a lot of the, the enthusiasts, the Bitcoin purists who just, loved the white paper, Satoshi's white paper and the vision that he outlined. And they couldn't understand, like, guys, the whole point was for it to be trustless and so forth. And then why would you hand over your keys? And they were going around, I remember this like adamantly telling people, no, Bitcoin didn't fail. It was these people gave their stuff over to this kid running Mount Gox. It was like it was like Magic the Gathering or something. Like that's what Mount Gox used to be, came from. So I understand the frustration, but then that's also why, Josh, that I had you elaborate so much, because I've noticed too, even more recently, talking with some, I guess you'd call them Bitcoin maxis, where I explain, what we're doing at Infineo, or just more generally talking about, putting real world assets on. And some of these people think, no, that like you're mixing two things that's oil and water. Like you can't put real world assets on blockchain because blockchain only really works in its pure vision if the asset is the cryptocurrency, like the Satoshi being moved, not, there's this thing on a blockchain that's pointing to a piece of real estate or, pointing to a HELOC or whatever. So I get where they're coming from, but so be it. Maybe I'll just let you see that train of thought, like that mindset where someone can think, no, blockchain only is for moving intangible things like Satoshis around. And what do you mean you're putting real world assets on a blockchain that's kind of mixing two things and they don't go together? So obviously you disagree. What would you say to somebody like that?
No, I honestly, for the most part, I agree, actually, which may be surprising.
It is surprising. So explain.
Yeah. So, I think there's two parts. There's the purest form where everything is on blockchain. Everything gets originated on blockchain and trades on blockchain. And that is the goal. It needs to be decentralized, originated, and traded on blockchain. And I think that has to be the goal. And not to keep mentioning the figure, but, I think they were on Bloomberg yesterday announcing their decentralized everything market. And this is a market that is truly decentralized with I'll say a term, we can get into it, but the MPC wallets, it's just a way of decentralizing wallets and custody over an asset where the custody is truly decentralized. So you're not repeating an FTX. And in that market, you'll be able to, I believe, beginning towards the end of April, you'll be able to trade, spot Bitcoin, spot Ethereum, I believe hash as well. But what is interesting about it is the counterpart is you also have a regulatory environment that you have to comply with. And you can disagree all you want with the regulatory environment. I think a lot of it's there for good reasons, some of it not. You still have to comply, right? And so that is where you want to have that regulatory stack, if you will. So there's multiple ATSs on Provenance, what are alternative trading systems, that allows you to use blockchain assets and then trade in that SEC-approved alternative trading system where you have a broker-dealer, you have a transfer agent that exists in the real world. But the goal of all of this is to prove over time that it can be done on blockchain. And then you start to have all of that come onto blockchain in a regulated way. But it's going to take time, and for good reason, for regulators to get comfortable with all of this trading on blockchain. And I really don't think Figure gets enough credit for what it's done in that decentralized space. A lot of them, may view it as a more of a centralized play, but what they've done is the HELOCs that are done on Provenance, those are digitally native assets. They begin their life cycle on blockchain. And they've done it in a regulated way where even, they've been able to do like the first blockchain AAA rated ABS with Goldman and JP Morgan. And those are digitally native assets. And the reason why, sorry, this is long-winded. No
problem.
But the reason why I think a lot of people criticize real-world assets, and they're right to, is a lot of what has been done on blockchain is just digital twinning of assets. It's not digitally native assets. And so when you look at a lot of the announcements that's been off in the space, it's been someone keeping two ledgers. And in that case, you have no enforceability mechanism in the real world if you're holding a token, and that's a problem, and the purists are right. But if you have an enforceability mechanism in the real world because you've done your UCC filing, you've perfected ownership of the asset, and whoever is then trading that asset on chain, then you're able to get, I think, 80 to 90% of the way there with what the purists want. On-chain price discoverability, on-chain trading, actually having authority in the real world to state ownership of your asset in a court should it go to that. And if you're just digitally twinning assets, you can't. So, and your costs are high. So why?
Right. Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. I get why you gave a nuanced response originally. So, right, and I think I agree if I understood you with everything you just said. So, yeah, just I'm just saying, thinking out loud here just to clarify. So, right, where the purist, the Bitcoin maxi type person's coming from is to say, if it's something like Bitcoin in its pure form, that right, using the blockchain or whatever, that's it says, if we say who owns these Satoshis, it's like, oh, it's at this address. And how do we know? Well, because that's what the blockchain says and it's validating. We know the proof of work and blah, 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 and all that stuff. Okay. And then it's not a separate thing. Whereas if you used a blockchain that was purely decentralized, a public blockchain and so on, but what the thing was to say, oh, yeah, the person at this address has this thing that we just all agree means you own the house at this address, this physical address. That's what it means to say you have that token, at your address on the blockchain. Well, then that's a separate step, right? Because, ultimately, if the local police don't agree, because I don't care what you show me on your computer screen, like, no, the local strongman said that he owns that because it goes back to his grandfather. And so, and we have more guns.
That's right.
We have a bunch of guns. And he owns it, right? Like, so that's kind of with the disconnect, what they're saying. Whereas in Bitcoin, as long as the network, the community of Bitcoin users agrees with that, if you're on the right fork of the chain, then that's the same thing. To say, no, I really do own those Bitcoins, it's the same thing as saying I control them. Whereas with a, quote, real world asset that, corresponds to something where the blockchain's like pointing to something external to the chain that is itself valuable, then they're saying there's an extra step involved. But I think, what you just said dovetails perfectly with that. And I guess the dispute's then just to say, you and I agree with that distinction, say, yep, there is an extra layer involved, but it's still worth doing. Whereas the purists say, well, no, so therefore it's not worth doing.
Yeah, at some point, the digital always has to interface with the real world. And Bitcoin maxis, you don't have to have that interface until the moment you want your Bitcoin to trade with something in the real world. And then you have all of those same questions, right? Legalities, how do you off ramp? How do you on ramp? Do you need ID? Must you KYC? Like all of these questions are going to keep coming up. And so, yeah, in complete agreement with you. But at some point, even Bitcoin has to interface with that second layer if you want to extract value from it, right? Or exchange value with a counterparty that's not a digital good.
Right. Okay, maybe just the few minutes we have left here, I want to circle back. So in your LinkedIn profile, I knew this also from previous conversations with you, but you say, let's see, I'm passionate about using code, creative marketing, design, and entrepreneurship as tools for social good and poverty elimination. So can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So, the work that I mentioned at Center House and the stuff that I did at Acumen, first I'll point everyone to acumen.org, an amazing organization that I've seen internally that really lives the values that it supports externally. But I think we've seen over the past, maybe 50 or 60 years that the fastest path towards eliminating poverty in the world is through business means, whether that is through, dare I say it, raw capitalism or through compassionate capitalism. There's many variant names of that. And I think it ultimately comes down to looking at the world through a lens where everyone has dignity and you have a goal of giving everyone equality of opportunity. Maybe not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. And everything that we're doing, whether it's tech or blockchain or even the financial services system, et cetera, it's just all tools to some human endpoint. And you can go through life just trying to make a number go up until you die. Or I think you can have, a focus where you're curious about the world and you view other people as mirrors of yourself rather than some enemy to be, ran from or criticized. And I think when you do that, you start to become more and more excited about using the tools that you have for better means, whatever better means to you.
Yeah, and I think it dovetails with what we were talking about earlier about like the adoption, that we're not going to get people in the financial sector to start using blockchain more unless the bottom line goes up. unless it makes economics, financial sense to do it, in which case you don't have to
That's right.
evangelize. It's going to happen sort of spontaneously. A different analogy, I remember people talking about like space exploration. And, what do we build a moon colony or what? And ultimately, I think that stuff's all going to happen once, private business figures out, well, how do we make money, putting a station on Mars or whatever the thing may be. Like it's instead of just governments pouring R&D into it, which may happen up front, but in the long run, to get something to work, it's got to be profitable. And likewise, too, with what we're doing in Infineo, we have in our staff like a lot of religious people. And so I say to them, it's not just that I think we're going to be a very big company and be profitable, but we are going to be helping lots of people around the world, allowing people, especially if you're in a country that, the currency is very volatile. If you can just get online, even occasionally, and then have this account with Infineo where, you have a life insurance policy that you make contributions to, and it's denominated, in a different currency that's more stable than yours. Like just pointing out, look at how much that's going to help somebody, much more than a Canadian or American where they have, other conventional analog counterparts. But, people in certain places of the world, that's really going to be life-changing. So it's, but again, to make that, what's going to motivate people to go build those things that are going to help the billions of people around the world who are less fortunate than we are. I mean, yeah, you can try to rely on altruism, but really what motivates people and makes it sustainable is if it's sort of a win-win relationship.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, it's going to be a lot of different levers and a lot of different places. It's going to require, the religions of the world. It's going to require the capitalists of the world. It's going to require every lever that we have. But, I think the true promise of where blockchain interacts with that is, I think there was a report by the World Bank in 2021. There's still 1.4 billion unbanked individuals in the world. And, there's roughly, 20 to, 40 million, depending on the day, nationless and refugees that are in between states in the world. Many of them having to flee, nation states where they own the property and they own education credentials and identity credentials and these things. And now they're no longer relevant and they can't prove they're as human, basically. Right.
Yeah, right.
And so if we get to the place where blockchain can integrate into the regulatory stack, and I know that is the devil for many in the whole Web3 community, sort of integration in both. But, I'm a realist, and you have to operate in the world in which we live, not just only in the world that we wish to be. And if you can get to a state where you can prove that your money, that your identity, that your nationhood, the property that you own is, valid, and someone couldn't tamper with the immutability of that, there's a lot of tools that open up in order to help the unbanked, the underserved, refugees, the nationless, etc. And I don't think you have to be a lefty or a righty in the American context to want to give people the basic forms of dignity and proper property ownership. And I think whether you're a Bitcoin maxi or you are anti-Bitcoin or whatever it may be, that is a goal that most people can get behind. The question is, how do we solve it? And any mechanisms that allow for truth over trust in the middle of that, I think, can be beneficial if we can get there. But it's going to require the regulatory stack and nations allowing for you to use rule of law to enforce ownership and of these identities and property, etc.
Yeah, I mean, just as something as pedestrian as like the DMV, right? Like in the United States, I don't know if this is true in other countries, but it's like sort of a running joke about how the Department of Motor Vehicles is the epitome of government inefficiency. So, but the last 10 times I've been to it, it actually hasn't been that bad. And it's because of technology. Like they have kept it. It's a lot quicker than it used to be. And again, it's because of technology. So likewise here, yeah, I think you and I are never going to be thrilled at the efficiency and altruistic zeal of the average politician around the world, but still the tools that you at Provenance and we here at Infineo are trying to build, I think is going to help make it more efficient all around. So my guest, folks, has been Josh Maddox, the head of developer ecosystem at Provenance Blockchain Foundation. Josh, thanks so much for your time and your insights.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and look forward to collaborating more with Infineo as time goes on. Thanks for
Yes,
having me.
indeed. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
This concludes another episode of InFi, the Future of Finance, with Dr. Robert Murphy. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the host and for previous episodes, visit InFi, thefutureoffinance.io. Thanks for listening.